I wanted to start with a deep dive into a distant part of American history, and I'm referring to last month. Some of you may remember this. CNN decided to allocate a little bit of its airtime to a missing airplane. It was a story that was briefly in the news. And at one point, the host who was on air at the time, Don Lemon, said this: a lot of people have been asking about black holes and on and on and on and all of these conspiracy theories. And he listed some more theories, and then he says, I know it's preposterous, but is it preposterous? And then one of his guests, former Transportation Department official named Mary Schiavo, replied that a small black hole would suck in our entire universe. So this, there was a lot of discussion of this online. Many people mocked him for asking the question. Many people mocked the answer. There was so much mockery to be done for those two reasons that not many people noticed one more strange thing, which is that a black hole is not a conspiracy. If you're stepping into fantasy and having like an event horizon, you know, hovering over the water, you might as well go a little bit further and say, okay, a secret society of wizards put it there. But it's not per se a conspiracy. So, that wasn't the only time that someone made that sort of category error during the Flight 370 discussion. There was a video, for example, at the Daily Beast that promised to list the, quote, kookiest conspiracy theories about the missing flight, and they had, you know, several conspiracy theories. They also put in it being hit by a meteor, which I'd love to know the conspiracy that could hurl a meteor, and also it landing safely on an island and going into hiding. So I just want to sort of begin by raising this question: where does that category error come from, where we hear black hole and think conspiracy? And I'm going to leave that question dangling and come back to it at the end. In the meantime, though, I'm going to go a bit further back into history, not that much further, but January 30th, 1835. And let me set the stage for you. Andrew Jackson, president at the time, is leaving a congressman's funeral, and an assassin, or a would-be assassin, approaches him, draws a pistol, and points it at the president. The pistol misfires. He's prepared. He has a second gun. He pulls that out. It misfires too. Jackson, wielding his cane, joined by the bystanders, the sort of the instant DIY Secret Service system of the day, subdued the assassin, or would-be assassin, I should say. He turned out to be an unemployed house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence. Lawrence later informed interrogators that he was King Richard III, that Jackson had killed his father, and that with Jackson dead, quote, money would be more plenty. He was judged insane. He was committed to an asylum where he died 3 decades later. He was a lone nut. Or at least that was the official story. It wasn't long before 2 witnesses filed affidavits claiming to have seen Lawrence at the home of the Mississippi Senator George Poindexter shortly before the attack. Poindexter was a noisy opponent of the Jackson administration, and pro-Jackson newspapers quickly started accusing the senator of plotting the president's murder. So did Jackson's allies in Congress, who convened an investigation, and Jackson himself told bystanders after the assault that the shooter had been, quote, hired by that damned rascal Poindexter to assassinate me. Some of Jackson's critics countered by suggesting that the assault was a false flag attack. They didn't use that phrase back then, but that's what they were saying. It was staged by the president to gain public support, and that this is why the 2 guns did not fire. And many Jacksonians pointed their finger at John Calhoun, the South Carolina senator and former vice president, arguing that if he had not been directly involved in the assassination attempt, and maybe he was, they said, but even if he wasn't, he had at the very least incited it with a speech denouncing Jackson as an American Caesar. That being what people said because Hitler was not yet available. So as you might guess from the fact that the story ended with Lawrence in an asylum, all these charges and countercharges eventually fizzled out. But they were not entirely forgotten. 29 years after the assassination attempt, a Republican writer named John Smith Dye worked them into an even larger plot. Calhoun might not have been directly involved in the assault, Dye conceded, though then again maybe he was. But he believed that Calhoun was part of a Southern cabal that would have benefited if Jackson had been put in the ground. And this cabal, he informed his readers, was more than willing to kill a powerful man to get his way. In 1841, Dye said, President William Henry Harrison told Calhoun he wasn't sure he was willing to annex Texas, which Southerners wanted to add to the Union as a slave state. Harrison promptly died. Officially, the cause of death was pneumonia, but Dye was sure that arsenic was to blame. 9 years later, Dye continued, President Zachary Taylor opposed the slave power's agenda in Cuba and the Southwest, and so he was killed by the same poison. And when President-elect James Buchanan prepared to make some appointments that the slavocrats didn't like, Buchanan narrowly escaped death, Dye wrote, via one of the most elaborate plots ever conceived. On February 23, 1857, Dye explained, Southern agents poisoned all the bowls containing lump sugar at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. Southerners, Dye explained, drink coffee, and coffee drinkers use pulverized sugar. So if you poison the lump sugar, the Southern diners would all be spared, while the tea-drinking Northern diners, including Buchanan, would be wiped out. The future president barely survived the illness that followed. Intimidated by the attempted assassination, Dye wrote, Buchanan became more than ever the tool of the slave power. Now, in case you're wondering, there's not much in the way of evidence for Dye's explosive charges. You can make a case that William Henry Harrison's doctors did more to hurt than to help the ailing president, but no more than conjecture supports the idea that anyone deliberately killed him, as opposed to just not knowing what they were doing. Coroners debunked the belief that Zachary Taylor had been poisoned when his body was exhumed in 1991. As for James Buchanan, he was not even present in Washington on February 23, 1857, though dysentery did break out at the hotel when Buchanan stayed there a month earlier, and again when he returned for his inauguration. Today, those outbreaks are usually attributed to a sewage backup that contaminated the inn's food and water, but at the time, several stories circulated blaming poisoners for the illnesses, with the suspects ranging from a Chinese cabal to a band of homicidal abolitionists. Inconveniently for the whole tea and coffee theory, the dead included a Southern congressman, John Quitman of Mississippi. But when Dye's book, The Adder's Den, was published in 1864, the country was at war with the South, and when an expanded edition appeared 2 years later, the nation was still reeling from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So in that atmosphere, Dye's book received a respectful notice in the New York Times and was excerpted in the Chicago Tribune. And Dye didn't invent his theories from nothing, by the way. He drew on assassination rumors that had been floating in Whig and then Republican circles for years. In fact, when Abraham Lincoln first came to the White House, people wrote him saying, watch what you eat. They killed Harrison, they killed Taylor, they might poison you too. And the assassination theorists weren't the only Americans worried about the conspiracies of slaveholders. Lincoln himself believed that he could, quote, clearly see a powerful plot to make slavery universal and perpetual. And in his famous House Divided speech, he engaged freely in conspiratorial speculation. Senator Henry Wilson, who later served as vice president, put the idea bluntly: slavery organized conspiracies in the cabinet, conspiracies in Congress, conspiracies in the states, conspiracies in the army, conspiracies in the navy, conspiracies everywhere for the overthrow of the government and the disruption of the republic. And meanwhile, of course, Southerners were imagining elaborate conspiracy theories of their own, blaming slave revolts, both real and imagined, on the machinations of rebellion-stoking abolitionists, treacherous land pirates, and other alleged outside agitators. My favorite conspiracy theory of the era appeared in the New York Tribune in May of 1868, in an extraordinary article that accused a Democratic conspiracy that's Democratic with a capital D, of engineering the city's malaria outbreaks, after commenting that Zachary Taylor fell under the malarious vapors of Washington and died because he was prone to, quote, acting honestly and straightforward. The Tribune writer claimed that Washington in subsequent years was free of malaria, that is, for Democrats. But when the new Republican Party began to gain strength, and it was possible they might become the ruling power in Congress, the water of Washington suddenly grew dangerous. The hotels, particularly the National, became pest houses, and dozens of heretics from the Democratic faith grew sick almost unto death. The contagions continued, he continued, until Lincoln put the walls and the springs of the Capitol under the care of loyal soldiers, ending the outbreaks. But after Lincoln was deposed, the pattern returned. Right before the vote to impeach Johnson, the writer said, we had a return of that bad water, and 2 or 3 senators, Republicans, mind you, are prostrated with sudden illness. What does it mean? Why does it happen that whenever the current set against the master demon of slavery, and never at any other time, we find the air and the water and the whiskey of Washington full of poison? So it was a paranoid time, but in America it's always a paranoid time. Pundits tend to write off political paranoia as a feature of the fringe, a disorder that occasionally flares up until the sober center can put out the flames. I think they're wrong. The fear of conspiracies has been a potent force across the political spectrum from the colonial era to the present, in the establishment as well as the extremes. Conspiracy theories played major roles in conflicts from the Indian Wars of the 17th century to the War on Terror today. They have been popular not just with dissenters and nonconformists, but with individuals and institutions at the center of power. They are not simply a colorful historical byway, but they're at the country's core. Now that's the 2 big themes in this book. That American political paranoia has always been a force in the establishment as well as the extremes. Conspiracy theories are not just for social outsiders. In the book, I talk about what I call elite paranoia. At the same time that American slaves were whispering that white doctors were plotting to kidnap and dissect them, the planter class was constantly seized by fears of slave conspiracies. At the same time that the populist parties, rabble-rousers, were warning about East Coast banking cabals, Eastern elites were perceiving populism itself as a product of a conspiracy. At the same time that the New Left was formulating conspiracy theories about Lyndon Johnson, Lyndon Johnson was pushing his attorney general and the FBI for evidence that the communist bloc was secretly behind the country's riots. It's even possible for an idea to travel from the fringes to the mainstream and to be embraced by elites who probably would have scoffed at it just a few years before. A great example is the Satanism scare of the 80s and early 90s, when notions that had been largely confined to a conservative Christian netherworld in the 70s were suddenly taken very seriously by politicians, prosecutors, juries, and the mainstream media. And I'm not going to get into how that happened in the main part of this talk, but it's in the book, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. But then there's the second theme of the book, and that's the fact that conspiracy theories are a sort of American folklore. Not just American, but I'm looking at American conspiracy theories. Now, some conspiracy theories turn out to be true. It's the words in the language for a reason, right? Sometimes people conspire. Some mix true allegations with more dubious ideas. But even when a conspiracy story says absolutely nothing true about the subjects of the theory, it says something true about the anxieties and the experiences of the people who believe it. Just as an animist treats natural forces as conscious spirits, a conspiracy theorist sometimes treats social forces as conscious cabals. A restriction on national sovereignty becomes a UN occupation. Lousy conditions in the ghetto become a plot against blacks. A loss of liberty becomes a plot against liberty. A challenge to power becomes a plot against power. And the purpose of the book is not so much to debunk or to espouse any conspiracy folklore, but just to explore it, to see what we can learn about America by taking this panoramic view of the history of our fears. And to sort of organize those fears and make sense of them, I identified 5 primal myths or sort of 5 conspiracy narratives that we keep hearing again and again. Now, by using the word myths, I don't mean to suggest that the stories are never true. Again, sometimes people do conspire. But I mean that they're culturally resonant ideas that appear again and again when Americans communicate with one another. Archetypes that can absorb all kinds of allegations, true or false, and arrange them into a familiar form. And I call these 5 primal myths the enemy outside, the enemy within, the enemy below, the enemy above, and the benevolent conspiracy. I'll look at them one by one. The enemy outside is defined by the fact that you think he's out there trying to come in. The details vary at different times and places, but several characteristics recur. There's the image of the world outside your gates as an unfriendly wilderness where evil forces dwell. There's the proclivity to see those forces as a centralized conspiracy guided by a puppet master or a small cabal. There's the fear of the border zone where cultures mix, the suspicion that aliens at home are agents of a foreign power, and the fear that your community might be remade in the enemy's image. And there is the tendency to see this conflict in terms of a grand apocalyptic struggle, sometimes literally against Satan, and if not that, then against something deeply evil. And there's sort of, this has appeared in many forms in American history, but the 2 that are sort of like at the root, or sort of the first ones we had that often the other stories have imitated. The first was the fear of Native American conspiracies. Settlers came to this country. They clearly had reason to fear Indian attacks, just as Indians had reasons to fear colonists' attacks. But there was also sort of the idea of a vast conspiracy and a notion that took hold in some quarters that Satan had actually come to the New World and brought some of the unconverted pagans with him from Europe and set them up as the Indians, and was directing their attacks, from below. I should say. I almost said from above. And the other sort of great classic example of the enemy outside is the anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. And if Indian conspiracies sort of embodied white Americans' fear of the anarchic New World, papal conspiracies came to embody their fears of the aristocratic Old World that they had left behind. Of course, that didn't keep people from imagining the Indians and the Jesuits working together, because still. All right, the second primal myth, the enemy within. The most essential element of the enemy within is that anyone could conceivably be or become a part of the conspiracy. With the enemy outside, the conspirators are conspicuously alien. In this case, though, the plot permeates ordinary society. The classic example is the Salem witch trials, which I know you all had a talk about here a few months ago. The great pop culture example, or any movie about pod people, body snatchers, and so on. And again, it's not just that anyone could be a part of the conspiracy, it's that anyone could become it. Your own spouse or children might be forced to sign Satan's book, or might be taken over by the pod, in the most extreme versions of these stories. The third archetype is the enemy below. In this story, as with the enemy within, the community's foe is found inside the city's gates, but these conspirators are not indistinguishable from everyone else. They hold a distinct position at the bottom of the social pyramid, or at the very least, lower on the pyramid than the people who are afraid. And in the enemy below story, they aim to overturn that pyramid. They're alien but familiar, with a well-defined place in society, perhaps even an essential role in the economy. If the enemy within can be imagined as a mob whose members have been seduced or conned into losing their individuality, the enemy below is presumed to be not quite human in the first place, a bestial force with monstrous appetites, a collective id eager to rape, burn, loot, and massacre. The classic example in this case were the fears of slave conspiracies among the plantation owners. And then actually, I point to Southern examples, but slavery was present in the North earlier in the colonial era, and you have, one of the main cases I write about was a big slave conspiracy fear in Manhattan in the middle of the 18th century. And the pop culture example is not pod people, but zombies, right? And if you actually think about the evolution of zombie stories, the early zombie movies, they stress the power of the monster's masters, and the later ones usually drop the equation, the master from the equation. From Night of the Living Dead on, zombies are appetites on autopilot, released remote control. And the idea of the enemy below really rests on two great fears. One is that a subversive force could somehow step into the role of the mesmerizing master, right? The outside agitator coming in and suddenly the slaves are obeying someone else. And the other great fear is that the master might disappear altogether, transforming zombie slaves into an unrestrainable zombie rampage. And by the way, if you ever watched Birth of the Nation, which is D.W. Griffith's movie, a very racist tribute to the Klan that came out in the middle of the 19-teens, you can see like the sort of the origin of the zombie movie there. There's even like a scene where they're holed up in a cabin, and you have this, the black characters all sort of surrounding it and trying to knock down the doors, and it's just echoed in Night of the Living Dead and moving forward. So, next archetype, the enemy above. To borrow a phrase from the Founders' Day, this is, quote, the silent, powerful, and ever-active conspiracy of those who govern. So governments, large corporations, other powerful institutions. If a conspiracy story features the CIA, it probably belongs in this category. These have been around for a long time, and if you don't believe me, you should go get on Google and see if you can pull up a copy of an obscure old conspiracy tract called the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration, it does not merely describe a long train of abuses and usurpation. It argues that those abuses added up to, quote, a design to bring the colonists under absolute despotism. The founders struck the same theme in other contexts. Thomas Jefferson wrote that an isolated act of oppression may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but America, he said, was undergoing a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers, and that meant that it faced a deliberate and systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. George Washington wrote, there was a regular systematic plan that threatened to reduce the colonists to, quote, tame and abject slaves, as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. A little bit of projection there. Alexander Hamilton said a system of slavery was being fabricated against America. The Continental Congress, in an official statement adopted by the body, denounced the ministerial plan for enslaving us and issued a warning to the people of Great Britain, may not a ministry with the same armies enslave you? Wake up, sheeple. Of course, there were real restrictions on the liberty and self-government of the Americans being imposed. The question is, were they right to see it as a conspiracy? And I think most historians would say no, but that was how it was perceived at the time. And that passed on into the early days of the Republic. The Jeffersonian conspiracy theorists about the Federalists. And then after Thomas Jefferson became president, it got turned around, and the Federalists who had been having sort of enemy below theories about the Jeffersonians found out ways to have enemy above theories about them now that they were in charge. But be careful. In the media, the phrase conspiracy theory is often used as though it refers only to enemy above stories. And sometimes you needn't even invoke a conspiracy to earn the conspiracy theorist tag, as long as you entertain suspicions about the people in charge. So again, think about that question of the category error that we'll be coming back to. And then the fifth of these archetypes is the benevolent conspiracy. This is not a phrase for people who think the CIA killed Kennedy, but he had it coming. This is the idea that there's a secret force working behind the scenes to improve people's lives, and in a particularly American version of the story, to help America reach some sort of special destiny. So Rosicrucians, angels, benevolent extraterrestrials, a group of secret chiefs who live in Tibet and guide over us. These are the benevolent conspiracies. So those are the five types. And I want to stress these are ideal types. In practice, people often mix and match them. I said, for example, that Salem was a classic enemy within story, and it was. But there were times when it also became an enemy outside story. At one point, Cotton Mather suggested that the spirits attacking the community were allied with the colony's human enemies. At their chief witch meetings, he wrote, there has been present some French Canadians and some Indian Sagamores to concert the methods of ruining New England. So you also have stories that evolve from one form to another. The John Birch Society, for example, attracted notoriety in the 50s by accusing various eminent Americans of being agents of the international communist conspiracy. And then in the 60s, it changed course and decided that international communism was in fact controlled by some powerful American capitalists. And then the society also suggested that black and student protesters were pawns of the same cabal, a setup that the Birchers described as pressure from above and pressure from below. And those shifts all took place within the worldview of a single organization. Conspiracy tales change even more dramatically, or can change even more dramatically, when a story leaks from one social group to another. For example, when black nationalists get a hold of a theory that develops on the white populist right, different people adopt and adapt these myths for their own needs, keeping the scaffolding of a storyline in place while changing the content. So you can't reduce conspiracy thinking. A lot of people try to do this. You can't reduce conspiracy thinking to a single social or psychological explanation. People ask me often, like radio interviews, like, well, aren't conspiracy theories just because of this? They say, conspiracy theorists are trying to simplify a complex world, for example. That's true of many conspiracy theorists. It's easy to think of examples. It's true of many theorists in general. That's the great thing about a theory. You use it to simplify the world. But there are others who delight in complicating something that seems simple. Taking one theory that calls consensus reality into question, piling it onto another, sometimes without regard for how well they fit together. They just like to say everything you know is wrong. Another sort of thesis people put forward, conspiracy theories take off because people can't accept randomness. The idea that a nobody like Oswald could affect the course of history. Again, clearly true in many cases. But again, there are also theorists who just thrive on anomalies. They love randomness. They seem happier at collecting the unexplained than they are explaining them. Anyone in the whole Fordian tradition, Charles Fort, and people who followed after him, that's what they love. Another one, conspiracy theories flourish at times of uncertainty and crisis. Again, obviously they do. The problem with the theory is that they also flourish at times of relative peace and prosperity. The 1990s, certainly like the golden age of my lifetime, right? Between the Cold War and the War on Terror, the economy's booming. What's on TV? The X-Files. What are people talking about on talk radio? The New World Order. Conspiracy theories appear for all kinds of reasons. And the most important thing to realize about conspiracy thinking is that we're all capable of it. They're inevitable, conspiracy theories are, for three reasons. First, we are pattern-seeking storytelling creatures. If there's a gap in the data, we'll try to fill it in a way that seeks, or that makes a coherent picture. It would be hard to survive if we couldn't draw inferences like that. As David Friedman has put it, we are equipped with a superb pattern recognition software so good that it can even find patterns that are not there. Right. Second, frightened people see frightening patterns. If you've got a reason to be scared or suspicious, and all of us do it sometimes, then that anxiety is going to inform the speculations that you use to fill those gaps in the data. So if you combine pattern spotting and fear, conspiracy stories are inevitable, especially so when you throw in reason number three, which is that sometimes a conspiracy really exists. I mentioned that before, but I just want to underline it. We had a lot more conspiracy theories starring the CIA starting in the 1970s, and that's because a lot of real CIA misbehavior had just been exposed in congressional investigations and the press. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more NSA conspiracy theories moving forward now. It's not like being afraid of vampires where at some point you notice that the undead have not shown up. It's periodically you turn on the news and say, oh, NSA is watching. Okay, bear that in mind. So basically, with that in mind, let me pick up the question that I left dangling at the beginning about the black hole. In the last few decades, I should say, our language has evolved in this strange direction. People started using the phrase conspiracy theory to mean implausible conspiracy theory. And then they started using it to mean implausible theory whether or not it involves a conspiracy. All right? It's a way of underlining this idea that conspiracy theories are just something for those people way out on the fringe. Conspiracy starts to mean fringe. Black holes, Illuminati, same diff, right? And that's just not true. All of us find patterns. All of us spin stories. All of us are capable of jumping to conclusions, particularly when we're dealing with other nations, other factions, other subcultures, or other layers of the social hierarchy. The conspiracy theorist will always be with us because at times the conspiracy theorist is going to be us. We need to recognize that, and we need to approach the world and ourselves with all the appropriate skepticism. And on that note, here with the crowd of skeptics, I think I'll open up the floor for questioning. Thank you. Yes.
Well, one of the last things you said about we are people of, I forgot what you said now, fear and storytelling and looking for things.
Patterns, yeah.
Sounds like religion, organized religion.
Yeah.
So is that a big conspiracy theory?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, what I sort of get at with the benevolent conspiracy is that these are secularized, and sometimes, as with angels, a not so secularized way of talking about God, right? The concept of God. It becomes the secret chiefs, but it's the same idea. And then the other ones have become secularized, or sometimes not so secularized ways of having that idea of the devil, you know? And religion is a current that just runs through this. And I think religion has been a big influence on conspiracy theories, and vice versa. You know, I mean, people come to notions about what the devil is up to, and then they, apply that to their theology. Yes.
This might be tough to categorize all the way, but I've been stunned by the statements. Someone does a survey and says some large percentage of, say, the population of some, in this case, an Arab country, maybe Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, or someplace, believes that the Israelis and some Americans actually did the 9/11 plot. They planted bombs in the building. They made it appear, it couldn't have happened unless this is kind of like the danger above.
Yeah.
But in this case, it seems to be displacing the horror that their own identified group may have done this horrible thing, which is an interesting wrinkle.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of projection in conspiracy theories, and a lot of different motives for it. But I think you're right. I mean, that's one of the reasons, not the only one, why those stories have caught on. What was I about to say? Richard Hofstadter, who I criticize a lot in the book because I think he tends to sort of treat conspiracy theories like they're a constant, but they're on the fringe. But I think he's right. He has like a great passage where he talks about that projection and the ways in which it even shapes the behavior of the conspiracy theorist. You have Klansmen sort of imitating the structure of or how they imagine the structure of the Jesuits. Birchers imitating the structure of the Communist Party with their cells and so on. And there's this long history of people engaging in that and getting to the very specific thing about projecting people's behavior or what they sort of imagine or displacing it. I talk a lot about conspiracy theories about Mormons, which were very big in the 19th century. And one thing people were doing was imagining the sexcapades that they thought Mormons were getting up to behind closed door. And it just becomes clear as you read these documents. It's like people saying, what would I do if I had a whole bunch of women, And then they're sort of imagining, the Mormons doing it. It's such a clear case of projection. So, yeah, I think you're right. Yes?
I have a question. I'm not sure what you actually mean by conspiracy. Let me give you a simple example. Consider a suburban neighborhood surrounded by a large number of forests, and a group of real estate agents want to take a hunk of that land and develop a shopping center. From these agents' point of view, they're just doing business development. From the homeowners, they may consider a conspiracy of these real estate trying to urbanize their area. So would you call that a conspiracy?
I have a very capacious definition of conspiracy. I will say that if they believe the real estate agents are acting in secret and that they have a hidden agenda, then you could call it a conspiracy theory. Actually, this is not something I mentioned in the book, but I've written about elsewhere. When Colombia when they started buying up the land, the Rouse Corporation, is that what it's called? To build Columbia, people didn't know why the land was being built up, and there were actually people who thought the communists were buying up, land for some, probably right next to Washington. Who knows what they're up to? So there certainly is a long history of real estate conspiracy theories. Yes, anyone in the back row? Yeah.
You seem to suggest that there's something particularly American about conspiracy theories, but when I look at the rest of the world, I see plenty of examples. In fact, we heard one in the first question. So is the rest of the world really any less prone to this sort of thing?
I don't think so. I mean, I say at the beginning of this book, I'm not making a claim that America is more paranoid than other parts of the world. Obviously, the Middle East is full of conspiracy theories, or Russia is infamous. I'm sure the Norwegians have reasons to be afraid of that we can hardly dream of. But what I sort of set out to do is sort of look at American history through the lens of what have we been afraid of. It's like saying, if we sort of accept that conspiracy theories are everywhere, let's look at American history through that lens. I'm sure they are. I mean, I didn't do a comparative study. I did do a piece for the CNN website a few months ago that sort of looked at what's distinct about American conspiracy theories, like how were we influenced by, for example, being a frontier society. Obviously, we aren't the only frontier society in history, but when your enemy outside is a group of Native American tribes that you sort of imagine as savages, it's different from when the country right next to you is Germany, right? So I think that there is like a distinct there is an American style of paranoid politics, to turn the essay title on its head. Yes?
Follow up on his question. One place where I think the Europeans and us have in common is that everyone's become afraid of Islam. Mm-hmm. Don't laugh. Islamophobia is spreading on both sides of the ocean. Mm-hmm. Now, I wish to point out that in the United States, for example, there have been attempts to quote unquote outlaw Sharia law. Yeah. So what's been happening is that the state legislatures have been passing what I call dubious laws to basically outlaw Sharia law. Mm-hmm. However, there's a far more poisonous consequence of this. There's some of the nastier Islamophobes be arguing that Islam is not a religion at all. I mean, this has some deadly consequences. Okay, because let's assume that they start arguing that a practitioner of Islam gets stripped of his religious rights, so to speak. In other words, that mosque could be outlawed or taxed or whatever. That has consequences, because if they can do that to Islam, they can do that to any other religion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that a rule that actually stripped Muslims of their religious rights would pass in the United States or would survive a court challenge, but I agree that there is like a lot of really creepy Islamophobia that's circulating right now. And I actually saw a recent example in England, so it's not an American example, but just sort of as kind of over-the-top theorizing. They just announced something where it was, if you want to make a will Sharia compliant, then there's now like an official set of guidelines that will help people do this. And this was being presented as Sharia law being introduced into British law. Now, in fact, anyone who wants to make a will that does all these Sharia things already had the right to do this, right? But it was presented as, well, now the women aren't going to get their full 50%. Basically, people have always had the rights to be jerks when drawing up their will. There is an officially religiously enshrined way to do this, which they already had the right to do it. All that changed was now there were some guidelines for someone who wanted to help them do that. But it was presented as Sharia is getting a foothold, and that I thought was over the top. So, yes.
I almost got a glimmer of hope that some of these conspiracies would become obsolete. These conspiracy theories, like you mentioned, presidents in the mid-19th century dying because they were poisoned, but in fact they just got sick or whatever. Of course, public hygiene is improved, medical care. It doesn't happen. I don't think we've had any president since FDR that had died in office due to some physical issue. But then there's, you know, I thought of the AIDS conspiracy thing from, I guess that was in the 80s, where people said, you know, there was a health issue that got pulled into the conspiracy aspect. So I've lost my optimism that we can make any of these things obsolete. But I guess you touch on the AIDS aspect in your book. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, not in great detail, but I mean, not in great detail specifically about the AIDS conspiracy theories, but there were, in particular, because there is like a long history of medical mistreatment of, you know, people who are not well off in this country. There has been a history of people imagining conspiracies, you know, behind it. Sometimes real ones. The Tuskegee experiment is like the famous example, right? People who were deliberately left untreated for syphilis because they wanted to study whether syphilis affected blacks and whites differently, and this went on for decades. And there was, I mean, this is not even a conspiracy, it was just policy of, you know, people being, you know, coercively sterilized. Naturally, there were a whole bunch of conspiracy theories that flared up as a result of that about people being covertly sterilized, you know, via church's chicken or what have you. So that's the sort of, that's a real story that was circulating. So that's the sort of the context in which things like the AIDS conspiracy theories took off, you know.
You mentioned, well, one of the things that like I've kind of found is a lot of the conspiracies tell more about what the theorist is afraid of rather than what is really going on. I mean, no one ever comes up with a conspiracy theory involving their in-group or they're a member of. But and I remember somebody.
There's never been a person at a birth or convention who says, "Boy, I really like Obamacare. It's just too bad that he's not qualified to be president." You know. Yeah.
Right, and then I mean, like somebody once mentioned, like about the Kennedy assassination, how you suddenly had, right now we look back and we can sit and discuss whether it was the mafia or the CIA or the Cubans or whatever, but it started out as we're afraid of the Cubans, so it was the Cubans who did it, and then once we started finding out about the CIA involvement in Iran, then it became the CIA was the prime suspect, and after like finding out about the mafia, it was about. The mafia, they became the suspect. So, are we going to see some of that with things that are kind of unsolved crimes now, like Benghazi or Fast and Furious?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that they stay. I mean, you can't always predict what people are still going to care about 5 years from now. I mean, the Kennedy assassination has an almost unique resilience for like staying on something that people really deeply care about. In a way that people trying to shoot Gerald Ford does not. But I'm there were conspiracy stories about Squeaky Fromme at the time, but who remembers it now? But yes, I mean I think that when a story is less, and even even when there's legitimate questions left open about something, people's suspicions are going to evolve with the time. You mentioned the Kennedy assassination. The last big burst of Kennedy assassination sort of theorizing activity was like during the first Bush administration, right? I mean, people still continue to believe in very high numbers, but the last sort of burst of like, here's a new villain, I remember was then, with people saying maybe Bush was in the CIA earlier than we thought, and he was in on this, And then they reached a point where, you can't say Osama bin Laden was behind it. So they reached a point where you can't keep plugging people in. But yeah, I think you're right.
I think there is a threat, though, of the insider who is going to speak out and then is silenced in some way, and that becomes the whole core of another conspiracy.
Yeah, when somebody wants to leave an in-group and then dislikes that in-group, that often becomes, and in fact, this is the other thing that I think Hofstadter really got right. I mentioned one was the projection. The other thing I think he really got right was the role of the defector, or the alleged defector, because often someone claims to be a defector from the satanic cult or whatever, and it's not true. Or what's that?
The Masons?
Or the Masons, yeah, I mean, that's the classic example. But there are also like real cases of, former CIA agents coming forward and saying, I was involved in plotting to overthrow this government, and I really should not have. That was a crime, So, then you have the whole question of, which defectors do you take seriously and which do you not? Generally, the ones who say they were in the Illuminati are not to be believed. So, yes.
One of the big conspiracy theories that I grew up with surrounds UFOs. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, has a Belgian ever been abducted by an alien? Or was this sort of an almost purely American phenomenon?
There are UFO stories in other parts of the world, but I just write about them in the American context. So, oh, yes, Becky.
It got me confused a little bit about what's the conspiracies. I grant you the psychological mechanism of projection is involved in a lot of these things when they're not actually individual psychosis. For instance, if I believe that there's a conspiracy on the part of a group I call neocons and oil interests to get us into the war in Iraq, is that a conspiracy theory? And what does it mean? Am I irrational if I believe that?
I don't think it's irrational per se to believe in a conspiracy. I said, forthrightly, people do conspire. Whether what you just described even is a conspiracy theory, I mean, there are conspiratorial versions of that story and there are non-conspiratorial versions of that story, right? I mean, you can say there's a secret group of neocons in a room somewhere and they planted this here or whatever, or you could say there is this strong current in American Washington politics that is a neoconservative in its politics and has wanted war with Iraq and leaped on after 9/11, saying this is a time to move in that direction. I don't consider that a conspiracy theory. In fact, I think that's true.
So in other words, there is a conspiracy theory that you and I agree with.
Well, I don't know that even qualifies as a conspiracy theory because that's yeah, I mean, but there are conspiratorial versions of that story and there are non-conspiratorial versions of that story. I mean, I think it's very overt. I mean, you can read what people were writing in the Weekly Standard, right? It's very clear, what their position was.
Signed the document, in the late...
The PNAC, yeah. So, I mean...
We ought to invade Iraq.
Right, and that's not a secret document, that's a manifesto.
Yes. Good. I'm a skeptic, and do you think that there's any institutional way that we can promote skepticism and disbelief in these far-flung conspiracies other than people like us who try to think critically, have rational conversations with our friends, families, and neighbors? Obviously, teaching critical thinking in schools, but I can't think of really any other institutional way of spreading critical thinking. Have you come up with anything?
I do not have a lot of faith in institutional solutions. It depends on what you mean by institution. Obviously, you can make your own media these days, right? I mean, you can, describe in public fora what actual weighing of the evidence consists of. It's not just, what matches the storyline I want to believe, right? But that's all I can really offer. So, who has not asked a question? Who has one? Yes, in the back.
So, listening to what you've said so far, defining a conspiracy, I believe you've said that a conspiracy is a secret plan toward a secret goal. But I think you'd look at the world and say, well, there are conspiracies all over. Every business plan is hatched quietly, confidentially secret, most of what government does. I don't think that conforms with the general notion of a conspiracy. I think you have to add one other lever, which is legality. That is, it's a secret plan to an illegal secret goal, a goal that would otherwise not be permitted or achieved unless it was conducted secretly. So if a committee of the House goes into session Yes, if a committee of the House is in session, no doubt it could be working secretly if it's in camera toward a secret goal. It's not illegal, and I don't think people would call it a secret unless a conspiracy, unless it was pulling in also outside forces to achieve an illegal goal.
That leaves out my benevolent conspiracy. There's also, I think, again, there are border cases, you know, but I think that there are times when people might do something that's within the letter of the law, but they would not want exposed. You know, I think a lot of, you know, especially when you get to sort of you know, stories about mind control conspiracies, hidden persuaders, and so on. It's not against the, which I don't actually believe in subliminal seduction and so on, or I don't think it works. It's not against the law to try to do that. But if people were doing it and it was, you know, succeeding, that it's still sort of perceived as a covert attempt to influence people's thoughts. So I don't think illegality has to be a part of the definition. Yeah, I think that setting aside the benevolent conspiracy, you know, malicious intent is generally sort of what, or it's not even sort of malicious intent so much as an intent to do something that the conspiracy theorist doesn't want, right? Because you could have, you know, a conspiracy that you think believes it's acting in for the greater good, but you say no, they're not. So, over here, yes.
Okay, I heard that you said that the Birch Society went for rather than communist, it was wealthy people were behind their conspiracy. I was told it was the Illuminati.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, boy, the Illuminati. They're also what. All right, I don't even know where to begin with the Illuminati and the Birchers. I will say, first of all, for those who don't know, the Bavarian Illuminati was a historical organization founded on May 1st, 1776, a secret society in Bavaria within Freemasonry, which was suppressed about a decade later. And after it was suppressed, there were all sorts of conspiracy theories that it survived, went underground, was behind the French Revolution, and so on. In America, people were saying that Jefferson was an Illuminati agent, that, you know, the Illuminati were plotting to have bring slaves up or former slaves up from Haiti and come across the South, liberating. They wouldn't say liberating, you know, the plantations and burning and looting and so on. And it has become sort of a stock villain, especially since Nesta Webster, a British writer, started writing, you know, like 1920s or roundabout, actually slightly earlier, suggesting that the Illuminati were sort of behind, you know, world communism, world revolution. And she also connected it to wealthy people because she worked in bankers who tended to be Jewish in her telling, and Germans because World War I was just over. So the Birchers and other people on the right sort of reached back to that and pointed to the Illuminati. Sometimes, some of them said with certainty, yes, we're dealing with the descendants of the Illuminati. Others say, we don't know how far back it goes. This is a possibility. What I was referring to specifically was the idea that bankers and other, you know, financiers in New York were pulling the strings behind the communists, that there was this idea that they wanted a captive market there, this sort of, you know, Arm & Hammer times 50 kind of idea. And I should say also, although Webster and others were anti-Semites, the Birchers actually went out of their way to de-anti-Semitize their version of this story and just make it this sort of this financial elite that also included Gentiles. So it's very complicated and strange, and I could go on at greater length, but it intersects with the Illuminati stories, but it's not exactly the same. You follow up? Yeah.
At what point would you say a conspiracy is actually a conspiracy and not abstraction, deflection, and or damage control? To give like a simple example that's not so far flung from what you might think would actually happen. Supposing a strike is ordered on a terrorist suspect in a village in somewhere in the Middle East, and rather than just strike the suspect specifically, they just decide to take out the whole village, killing everyone in it. And obviously they don't want this reported that we just wiped out a village with a bunch of people, you know? So rather than tell like actually what happened, like they order reporters who cover the incident to just describe it as pacification. is that an active conspiracy to suppress what really happened, or is that just abstracting away what happened?
No, I mean, obviously, if there's a deliberate cover-up of what happened, I don't have a problem with calling that a conspiracy. And now, when you get into sort of the newspeak issue, like if people sort of know what pacification means and you're just sort of prettifying it, that's not necessarily a conspiracy. But if you're actively sort of covering up what happened, then sure.
I saw you were an editor for Reason, so I want to bring up conspiracy theory. I think that libertarians tend to like climate scientists invented global warming as an excuse to implement communism or socialism.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, when it's put that way, it becomes a conspiracy theory. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, there's lots of libertarians who are doubtful about climate change for essentially for ideological reasons, because then you don't have to worry about how you deal with it in a way that's consistent with libertarian policy. And anytime someone has anytime someone has like an ideological motive, it's possible to come up with a conspiratorial version of that. So
maybe one or two more questions, so we can have refreshments and we can all chat.
Although you said there was no correlation between that many people were susceptible to conspiracy theories, did you find any correlation between IQ and susceptibility?
She asked if there was any correlation between intelligence level and propensity to conspiracy theories. I didn't look at that, but I will say, to the extent I've looked at psychological studies, very intelligent people believe, are not less likely to believe this, and I certainly know there are very smart people who believe very baroque. In fact, I think there's certain at a certain point you need to be really smart to come up with some of the baroque structures that are imagined here. I mean, anyone can say, "Oh, yeah, I think those Jews are doing something," but once you're getting like the big flow chart, yes.
Well, I would say I want to talk more about the psychology because we're all sitting in the room, we're all skeptics, we're all laughing at these other people believe in all this weird stuff. But yet, there's two things. First of all, in the Washington Post this morning, there was an article about there's apparently a conspiracy to keep people from having raw milk in the Washington area, and I would like to think people in the Washington area are very highly educated, and we have people running around on the national news talking about vast right-wing conspiracies, and these are very highly educated people who ought to know better. So no, it seems like, do you get it? I mean, what is the psychology of that? What makes somebody who's otherwise well-educated, intelligent, believe that, right-wing radio is conspiring against them, or the government wants to have raw milk?
Again, it's when you have a reason to be anxious and that propensity to seek patterns, you combine them. Everybody does that, It's, look, Bill Clinton, like probably the two smartest presidents of my lifetime, whatever you think of their politics, Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, right? Extremely intelligent people, right? Bill Clinton comes into office. He says to his friend Webster Hubbell, "Webb, if I put you over at Justice," was that where he worked? He says, "I want you to find out two things for me. Who killed JFK and are UFOs real?" And Webster Hubbell says he was serious. He wasn't kidding, right? Richard Nixon, now, of course, he knows a thing or two about conspiring, right? And he saw conspiracies all around him that helped fuel his own propensity towards conspiracies of his own. And he was told his assistant in the 90s, this Vince Foster thing stinks to high heaven, which makes me think he must have killed somebody, right? No, I don't think that, but that's his, if that's what he leaps to believing. But yeah, so it's very, and for that matter, there's this sort of Hall of Mirrors element. Look at J. Edgar Hoover, right? Look at COINTELPRO, which I write about in the book. First of all, it's an example of a real conspiracy, right? This is an FBI effort to infiltrate and deliberately disrupt at first it's just a communist party, and then it spreads to all sorts of organizations, far left, far right, civil rights groups, and so on. One of the ways they were doing, and the reason he was doing this was because he saw them as a conspiracy against the American body politic. He then conspires against them. And then one of the chief means of conspiring is to spread rumors that people are police agents who are not really police agents, so people won't trust each other. So you have basically a government conspiracy to defeat subversive conspiracies by convincing the conspirators they're being conspired against. it all reflects one against the other. So, do we have time for one more question? All right. Last question? Yes, back there.
Well, I think in this country, freedom, we have the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which I think in some countries they don't allow political cartoons, for example, or they put the dissenters in jail. They don't allow them to have their thoughts to be known to other people. And I do teach, this gentleman said it, do teach it in the Midwest, critical thinking and public speaking courses. This is what we try to do with people. But my question is, how do you come out with the opposite of a conspiracy theory when the Congress comes to the conclusion, the United States Congress, that only one person, Lee Harvey Oswald, pulled the trigger and assassinated John F. Kennedy? Like that doesn't make me feel very good. I think there should have been more conspiracy theory. Just because one man pulled the trigger doesn't mean that there was only one man behind.
Well, there are conspiracy theories that are embraced, and there are conspiracy theories that are sort of déclassé, right? Enemy above theories, which often JFK theories are, tend to be looked down upon, although there was sort of a golden age of them in the 70s because of like the CIA exposés, FBI exposés. That doesn't mean that the people who are frowning on them don't believe other sorts of conspiracy theories. So that would be my answer to that. All right, I'm going to be selling these, or who's going to be, you will be, okay. Thank you all. Thank you very much.